Well, good morning again.
Good morning.
I'm glad that you're here. If you weren't here with us last week, we just started a new series. We're doing a 7-week series leading up to Easter on the Stations of the Cross. And last week, Pastor Lee talked about the first station, which is the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, as it's often known, or the Passover feast that was shared between Jesus and his disciples the night that he was arrested. And if you're not familiar with the Stations of the Cross, kind of a little bit of history, sometimes it's referred to as the Way of the Cross or the Way of Sorrows, and it really refers to a series of images depicting Jesus Christ on the day of his crucifixion and accompanying prayers. The Stations of the Cross has a strong tradition rooted in the Anglican, Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist churches. So for any of you who grew up, maybe Lutheran or Catholic like I did, you're probably familiar with it. There is some debate on how many stations there are, depending on which church or background you have. But Pastor Lee talked last week about there being 14. We're going to be covering all of those in 7 weeks total. So this is our second week, and today we're going to be talking about Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. So that time where Jesus went into the garden is actually recorded in detail in 3 of the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's briefly mentioned in the book of John. So we're going to start by going through and reading how each of these Gospel writers documented it, that period, that moment, and see where there are some similarities and differences. So we're going to start in Matthew 26. If you have your Bibles with you, or you want to grab your phones and get your apps up, and the text will also be on the screen. But we're going to read through Matthew 26, 36 through 46 to start with. Then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." He took Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." He went on a little further and bowed with his face to the ground, praying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." Then he returned to the disciples and found them asleep. He said to Peter, "Couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? Keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation. For the spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Then Jesus left them a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done." When he returned to them again, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open. So he went to pray a third time, saying the same thing. Then he came to the disciples and said, "Go ahead and sleep, have your rest. But look, the time has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Up, let's be going. Look, my betrayer is here." And now we're going to look at Mark's account. If you look at Mark chapter 14, starting with verse 32. They went to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and Jesus said, "Sit here while I go and pray." He took Peter, James, and John with him, and he became deeply troubled and distressed. He told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." He went on a little further and fell to the ground. He prayed that if it were possible, the awful hour awaiting him might pass by. "Abba, Father," he cried out, "everything is possible for you. Please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." Then he returned and found the disciples asleep. He said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? Keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation, for the spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Then Jesus left them again and prayed the same prayer as before. And when he returned to them again, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open, and they didn't know what to say. When he returned to them the third time, he said, "Go ahead and sleep, have your rest." But no, the time has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Up, let's be going. Look, my betrayer is here. And then finally, we're going to look at the book of Luke, chapter 22, starting with verse 39. Luke writes, Then, accompanied by the disciples, Jesus left the upstairs room and went as usual to the Mount of Olives. There he told them, "Pray that you will not give in to temptation." He walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down to pray. "Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." Then an angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him. He prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell on the ground like great drops of blood. At last he stood up again and returned to the disciples, only to find them asleep, exhausted from grief. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, so that you will not give in to temptation." There's so much happening here in these verses, and when I read them, I'm kind of tempted to just jump straight into the emotional state of Jesus in this moment. It's, to me, one of the most raw and honest and real moments recorded in the Bible of Jesus' emotional state. But before we get there, I think it's important that we dissect this scripture just a little bit so we can understand what's happening. And I don't know if it's because I'm a writer or because I've been helping kids with science fair projects too much lately, but I thought we would look at the 6 W's, or the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So I want to start with the who. Now, according to all 4 Gospels, after the Passover feast, Jesus went out for a walk. But Jesus did not take the walk on his own. He had 11 of the disciples at least with him. We don't know. At some point, Judas must have left, because we know that right after this, he comes, and that's when Jesus is arrested. But at least 11 were with him. But in 2 of the gospel accounts, they talk about how when they got to the entrance, Jesus asked everyone but Peter, James, and John to wait. And this was not the first time that Jesus had singled out these 3 disciples in a very special moment. If we think back to the transfiguration of Jesus, which was an event reported in the New Testament, when Jesus was transfigured and became radiant in glory upon the mountain, recorded in Mark chapter 9. And it says that after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up high in a mountain where they were all alone. Why were these 3 chosen? Were they closer to Jesus than the other 9? We can't really say for sure, but we know that they were 3 of the first 4 disciples that were called to follow Jesus. We know that throughout the Gospels, Peter is often singled out, and his conversations with Jesus are well documented. And he is often referred to as Simon, or Simon Peter, or Cephas, which, interestingly enough, comes from the Aramaic for rock. And Peter comes from the Greek equivalent for the same. And we know that James and John were brothers and both fishermen from Capernaum. And we know that Jesus trusted John so much that he asked him to care for his mother Mary and transferred his sonship after his death. And in Mark, Jesus gives the 2 brothers the name, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Boanerges, which is Greek from the Aramaic, sons of thunder. So Jesus took with him the rock and the sons of thunder into the garden there, and he shared his innermost feelings with them. He said, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." There must have been something special about that relationship, that he shared those words with them and that he trusted them to pray and stay with him. So that moves to the what. What was the purpose for Jesus coming into the garden? And from the accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it seems clear that Jesus went there to pray. The Gethsemane prayer experience was unique for many reasons, but in respect to biblical chronological timing, it would be the last time recorded by any biblical authors where Jesus is praying before he's crucified on the cross. Now, only Matthew, Mark, and Luke record what Jesus actually says. John's gospel doesn't record the prayer or why Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, only that Jesus and his disciples crossed the Kidron Valley and went into a garden there, which is interesting. since John was said to be there as one of the three chosen to accompany Jesus. I mean, there's no way for us to know why John left out this recount of events. I have my own theories and thoughts, but anything I would say would strictly be speculation, so I'm just going to stick with the facts today. But we do know that in Matthew and Mark, they record the prayer in 3 sections, and they include a dialogue between Jesus and Peter, James, and John between each prayer. And Luke's gospel account leaves out the 3 movements of Jesus praying and going back to the 3 and instead merges it together. But in all 3 of them, they specifically talk about Jesus praying to God. So the when. We've got the who, the what, now the when. This one is pretty straightforward because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all account that Jesus went to the Mount of Olives after the Passover feast, or Last Supper, as we've come to call it, and before he was arrested. Now, the book of John indicates that after the Passover feast and the washing of the disciples' feet, there are several chapters that are devoted to Jesus comforting his disciples, praying for them, telling them what is to come. But in John 18, it says that just before his arrest, Jesus went to a garden. So the timeline is very consistent in all 4 Gospels, and it shows that it was after the Passover feast and right before his arrest that Jesus went to the garden to pray. And when we read through Jesus' prayers with this context in mind, then we can better understand the emotional state of Jesus and knowing that he must have known that he was just about to be arrested. So the where, and this part is really interesting, and there's a lot of, you read some of the commentaries in the Bible, and there's been so much written about the where. And each of the 4 gospel writers offers a slightly different account of the location. Matthew and Mark are consistent in identifying the place of prayer as Gethsemane, which was at the Mount of Olives. Luke identifies only the Mount of Olives, and John simply says a garden on the other side of the Kidron Valley. However, the word used in John means not properly a garden like we've come to think of it with flowers or vegetables, but a place planted with the olive and other trees. So with that in mind, I have a map. If you look at the map, you can see how geographically these 4 accounts are all consistent, because we have the city to the left, the Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives up to the right. So when they talk about crossing the Mount of Olives or crossing the Kidron Valley or going to the Mount of Olives, right at the base of that is where the Garden of Gethsemane is. And what's even more interesting is the meaning of the word Gethsemane, because the Hebrew word for Gethsemane is gat shemin, which literally means press of oil. So it's suspected by historians and theologians that in this area there was likely not just a grove of olive trees, but olive oil presses as well. So why is that important? Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but first I want to show you a little video that explains how olive oil is produced.
Hello, my name is Majd, and I'm one of the guides at Nazareth Village. We are standing in our fully functioning replica of a 1st century olive press. We are entering the rainy season at the moment, November and December, and this is the olive season, so our villagers already started harvesting the olives off of the trees, and we bring them in here in order to press them. Of course, olives are hard. You cannot just press them right away. The first thing you do in the process is crushing them. And that's what we use this big stone over here. Mosey the donkey is helping us move the stone around, and this stone will crush the olives and the pits. Everything needs to be crushed so finely until it turns into paste, and then it's ready for the next stage of pressing. The crushed olives then are placed in baskets like the one you see over here. We're hanging it on the wall, but of course you lay it flat, and then there are pockets to the sides where you put the crushed olives, preparation for the actual pressing process. And then you take about 10-15 baskets to press them together at the press. Now the baskets are brought over here and stacked on top of each other. Underneath them, there's a hole in the ground, that is about 2 feet deep, and it gets also a bit wider as it goes in. So as you press the baskets over here, oil is going to gather underneath. The beam of wood sits on top of the baskets, applying its weight as pressure, and then the 3 weights, the stone weights, are lifted using pulleys and leverage in order to apply more pressure on top of the baskets. Each group of baskets gets pressed 3 times. The first time you apply pressure, you get the best quality oil. And according to the Jewish law, the first of your fruits you offer to God. So the oil from the first pressing, they will not use at home. They will take it to the temple in Jerusalem. The second time they applied pressure, they got good quality oil, and it was used for food, medicine, perfume, and cosmetics. By the time they got to the third pressing, though, the quality of the oil was really bad, and they would use it for oil lamps and making soap. The olive press has a very strong connection with Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane comes from 2 Hebrew words, Gat Shmanim, and they literally mean press of oils. And the olive press is a great illustration of the pressure that Jesus was under as he was praying in Gethsemane, to the point he even started sweating blood. And he prayed 3 times, an equal number to the pressings. And even Isaiah 53 says he was crushed for our iniquities.
Okay, so anybody learn something new today? So it's a multi-step process to get the olive oil, and it starts with crushing through the millet stone, and then with pressing with heavy weights and pressing 3 different times. So there's a lot that goes into making the olive oil. So just keep that in your mind when you think about knowing that where Jesus was in Gethsemane, not just amongst the olive trees, but these presses, what we just saw here, there would have been at least 1 or more of those right in that location where he was. The other thing that I think is important to note about the where and the location where Jesus chose to go to pray is that according to John's Gospel, this was not the first time that Jesus had visited Gethsemane. Apparently, this was a place that Jesus had gone to regularly to pray, so it was a place that was known and comfortable to him. So that leads us to the how. We've discussed the who, what, when, and where, and before we get to the why, I want us to look at the how for a few moments, and specifically, how did Jesus pray? And our tutor here alluded to a little bit, but there's 3 different times that Jesus went to pray that are documented in the books of Matthew and Mark. Matthew says he went on a little further and bowed with his face to the ground, praying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine." The second time, Matthew says, then Jesus left a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done." And then it says in Matthew, so he went to pray a third time, saying the same things. And it's similarly documented in Mark. Now, Luke is a little bit different. He only records 1 prayer and says that Jesus, in Luke 22:41, he walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine." And of course, John doesn't specifically record the prayer, but if we look at the consistency of what is interesting to me is that Matthew and Mark emphasize the 3 separate prayers. And by the way, if you want something fun to do in your spare time, go look in the Bible how many times the number 3 is referenced throughout, or even just in Jesus' final days. It's a significant number. But even though Luke doesn't talk about it in 3 separate prayers or 3 separate acts, the words that Jesus prayed are consistent in all of the 3 Gospels that document it. Jesus is saying, "Lord, if you can take this cup away from me, but your will be done, not mine." And that leads us to the why. And I believe that this scene and this moment that's documented in these 3 Gospels was set as an inner battle with the flesh that was about to begin. Jesus was supernaturally getting ready to carry the sin of the world upon his shoulders. He knew what was coming. It was in clear view. The Lord had spoken to him. And he tells his disciples in both Matthew and Mark, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death." And I can imagine that it is at that moment that he started to feel the weight of all of the sin that he was going to be carrying and taking to the cross. And the grief for that, because we think about how much grief we feel when we're carrying our own hurt and pain and sin. And imagine that being heaped on one person, multiplied thousands times over, and how crushed his soul must have felt to be carrying that. We watched a few moments ago how olive oil is made by first crushing the olives and then pressing with heavy stones or weights. And I believe it is not a mistake that Jesus came to a place called Gethsemane, or oil press, to pray during this moment. And that the very words he used to his disciples was that his soul was crushed. How many of you have ever been in a place where you felt that you were being crushed by grief? There have been times in my life that my spirit has been crushed, and let me tell you, it's a really tough place to be. About 12 years ago, my marriage hit a place that was a very difficult spot, and many of you know Dave and I have been open in sharing that. It was a time when I was pregnant with our twins, and we had Hannah. It was only 2 at the time, and it was in a moment where I honestly thought that my marriage was over. And I was so overwhelmed with despair and the crushing reality that my life as I knew it, that the only man I'd ever loved, that all of these things we built together were not going to last. That this picture we had painted, the story that we had started to put together, was not going to end the way that I thought it was going to end, the way that I had planned and hoped for. And I remember one night lying in our bed just sobbing in the most ugly way possible, barely able to breathe through the tears, and it actually felt like I was being suffocated because the grief and the despair were pressing in on me so deeply. And in that hour of desperation, I cried out to God, because that's what we often do when we hit rock bottom and we're desperate. And I prayed similar words that Jesus prayed. I said, "Dear God, please take away this pain, take away my suffering, make this stop." But then I also prayed, "Please tell me what you want me to do here, because I'm lost and I don't know." And I heard God so clearly in that moment, and I think maybe that's how we are as humans. We hear him the clearest when we are the most broken and desperate. And he said to me, "Stay." And of course, we don't know what Jesus heard when he was in the garden praying that night. But given that on the second and third time that he prayed to God, he said, "If this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done." I believe that Jesus had heard God when he was there praying to him. That he knew what he had to do. I believe God spoke to him and told him that his pain would only be relieved after he went through with God's plan. He couldn't go around it because God had a bigger plan, and Jesus' death and crucifixion was the cornerstone of that plan. He was to become the spotless Lamb of God and take upon the sins of the world. When I heard God telling me that night to stay, it was because he had a greater plan for my marriage, for my husband and I, for my children, greater than what I could see in that moment. And we would have to go through months and even years of struggle and pain before that plan was fully revealed. But now today, I really can't imagine having a different life or having taken a different path. And of course, Jesus' anguish was so much greater than anything we could imagine. And I don't mean to belittle it by comparing it to mine and my marital struggles, but if you've ever been in a dark place of extreme pain and brokenness, if you've ever found yourself on your knees, laying on the bed, sobbing and feeling like you can't breathe, then just imagine how much deeper Jesus' anguish was. And yet he submitted himself to God's will. He trusted God to take the lead, even if it meant leading him to the most brutal, humiliating pain that none of us could ever imagine. And praise God that he did that, because none of us would be sitting here in this room if he hadn't. So what can we take from the story? How can we take this and apply it to our lives? Well, firstly, I think it's important that we learn from the order in which the events unfolded. We learn from the who, what, when, where, and how that we talked about. We remember that Jesus took 3 of his closest friends and advisors with him and asked them to pray for him. However, Jesus never sought their counsel. The only one whose counsel he sought was his heavenly Father, and it's a subtle but I think important part of the story. Because when we are in difficult places, it is so easy for us to turn to our friends and our family and seek their advice and counsel. And I am so guilty of this myself. I will call my mom or my best friend, lean on David, or truthfully often just lean on myself to try and solve a situation before I go and take it to God. What do you think would have been the advice of Peter, James, and John if Jesus had gone to them and asked them what he should do in that moment? Run. Yeah, probably, because they loved their friends. They would have wanted to protect him. They would have wanted to protect themselves. We see evidence of that later on when Peter denies Jesus. As much as they loved him, as good of men as they were, they did not understand God's plan. And it doesn't matter how great of friends and family we have and how much they love the Lord, they don't know his plan. And so we have to be careful, because when we rely on the counsel of our friends and family, we have to remember that they do not have the big picture that God has. They do not have God's view. And as well-meaning and intention as they may be, as much as we may love them and they may love us, they were never intended to be the ones guiding the decisions of our lives. They were never intended to replace God. So I'm not saying it's not important to seek out counsel from believers and from people close to you, but we just must remember that we need to seek God's will and guidance first, foremost, and above all else, especially in those moments of soul-crushing grief and fear. Secondly, when we pray to God, we can learn from how Jesus prayed. Jesus went away from the noise and even away from his friends to a quiet place where he could be alone and speak with God. And it's so much easier to hear God without the distractions that are around us. And the other thing is what he said. He admitted to God his fear. He didn't try and hide what he was feeling, because, let's be real, God already knew. He knew what he was feeling. So he admitted it to God, and then he asked for what he wanted deep in his soul. But ultimately, he also acknowledged that he trusted God above all else. By saying, "Your will be done, not mine," he was acknowledging his faith and trust in God and giving control over to him. And this is the part that is hard for me. I'm just going to tell you. I get stuck on this part, and I think a lot of us do. Sometimes we're too afraid to hand over control because we're not ready to see what the answer is when we let God guide our decisions. Or sometimes we hand over control only to then take it back a few moments later. But notice what else Jesus did. He prayed essentially the same prayer more than once. Even Jesus, who was God incarnate, needed to pray and give over his fears, give over control to God more than once. If Jesus needed to go to God 3 times, how many more times do we need to go to him? How many times do we need to go and ask for strength and to trust God and surrender to his will? I don't know about you, but some days I need to do this hourly. We can't pray once and then think, well, I still don't feel peace about this situation. I don't think I understand God's plan. I can't hear him. He's not speaking to me. So I'm going to go talk to my best friend about this. She'll know what to do. Because when we get away from the intimacy with God that we need in order to fully trust him, we get further and further away from his will and his plan for us. The third thing I think we can take away from this is the promise that God answers prayers, but always according to his plan. Jesus prayed to God, and God answered and even strengthened him with an angel to fulfill the will of God. That's recorded in Luke 22:43. Now, God's plan may require us to walk through some really hard, painful stuff, but we are never required to do it alone. Jesus had to suffer and die on the cross before we could be saved, but God was with him in the garden and on the cross. My marriage had to go through a period of brokenness to get better and stronger, but God was with me and David in our darkest hours. Sometimes we have to be crushed before we can fully deny ourselves and rely wholly on God, before we can fulfill God's predestined plans, because God is not in the business of giving us easy. God is in the business of creating redemption stories. And Jesus' prayers in the garden at Gethsemane demonstrates the purpose and power of prayer. The purpose of prayer is to help you follow the will of God for your life, not to bargain or debate with him about it. In the garden, Jesus is in his weakest state since his fasting and temptation by Satan that was recorded in Luke chapter 4, yet he never debates with God. There's an overwhelming demonstration in all of the Gospels that Jesus never even attempted to bargain or counter the will of God. He always submitted to his destiny and the purpose that God had for him. The purpose of prayer is to bring clarification concerning the will of God in your life. I already said I believe God spoke to Jesus and gave him clarification and confirmed for him what his plan was and what he needed to do. And the purpose of prayer is to represent a close personal relationship with God, where he will bring you confidence and he will strengthen you and support you while you are following his will. I'm going to ask the worship band to come back up here. I don't know where each of you are in your life this morning. I don't know if you are in the midst of a crushing, painful situation and ready to fall on your knees and ask God to take it from you. I don't know if you have been in a dark place in the past and struggled to trust only God with it, and instead you relied on yourself or the counsel of others, or perhaps tried praying and felt God just didn't respond, and you're feeling distant and disconnected from him because of that experience. I don't know if you're getting ready to go through a dark place and God is preparing you for that. But I do believe that each and every one of us are here this morning for a reason. Amen. I believe that God had something to speak into each of our hearts, something that he wanted us to hear while we were here. And when we walk out those doors, he doesn't want us to leave it here. He wants us to take that message with us. My challenge to you when you leave here today is that whatever God is speaking to your heart right now, you remember that and carry it with you. That you remember that Jesus was willing and able to take on the burden of our sin over 2,000 years ago. And as he kneeled in that garden, he was willing to turn over his life to God's will and plan. And he is still willing, wanting to take your burdens from you today. He wants to be the peace in your life's greatest storm. We have a basket here with little bottles of olive oil in them, because I do think it is symbolic that Jesus prayed in a place where they crushed and pressed the olives to get the oil that was so valuable. And so right now, I'd like for us to enter into a time of prayer and reflection. I want you to ask God to come in, whatever it is that you're carrying, whatever it is you're struggling with, ask Him to take that from you. And when you're ready, you can come up and get one of these little bottles. They're going to be right here. And then I'll close this out in prayer.